The rain has a different temper up here. Down in the parlor, amidst the velvet drapes and the heavy oak wainscoting, a storm is merely a suggestion, a polite tapping against double-paned glass that serves only to make the fire feel warmer. But here, directly under the slate shingles, the rain is violent. It hammers against the roof with a relentless, rhythmic fury, a sound like 1,000 angry fingers drumming on a hollow skull. It makes the air vibrate. I shouldn't be up here. The attic is the house's subconscious, a dusty purgatory where we banish the things we cannot bear to throw away but have no intention of ever seeing again. The air is oppressive, thick with a heat that defies the November chill outside. It's a suffocating cocktail of smells. The sharp, chemical temps of pink fiberglass insulation, the dry, crumbling scent of old paper, and the ghost of cedar chips that lost their potency decades ago. It tastes of dust and neglect. I navigated the maze of our past, stepping carefully over rolled-up Persian rugs that have been moth-eaten into lace. My target was specific: grandmother's vintage quilt, the double wedding ring pattern. David had mentioned a draft in the master bedroom, a complaint that usually signaled the onset of his winter melancholy, and I thought the quilt might serve as both a comfort and a distraction. I found myself in the far corner, under the lowest slope of the eaves, where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. A wall of cardboard boxes blocked my path, their sides warped and stained with water rings from a leak we fixed 5 years ago. They were labeled in David's expansive, jagged handwriting: tax returns 1998, missed receipts 2004, client files closed. I gripped the side of the 1998 box. The cardboard was soft, almost damp to the touch, yielding under my fingers with a repulsive lack of resistance. I shoved it aside, the box scraping loudly against the rough plywood subfloor. As I shifted my weight to push the next one, the toe of my loafer caught on something rigid. I stumbled, my hand shooting out to steady myself against a wooden beam that was rough with splinters. I looked down. It wasn't just a loose floorboard. The wood had been pried up, then set back down, but not flush. It sat askew, a jagged tooth in the mouth of the floor. Curiosity is a dangerous instinct. One I thought I had bred out of myself after 40 years of marriage to a man who valued his privacy above all else. But the anomaly nagged at me. In a room coated in a uniform layer of gray silt, this disturbance was fresh. I knelt, ignoring the protest of my knees and the dust that immediately coated the hem of my trousers. I hooked my fingernails under the lip of the board and lifted. It came away easily, resting in the space between the joists. Nestled into the itchy pink fluff of the insulation like a tumor was a lockbox. It was black metal, heavy-duty, the kind you buy to protect deeds and diamonds from fire. But what struck me, what made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up despite the heat, was its condition. Everything else in this attic was covered in the soft, gray fur of time. This box was clean, sleek, dark. It absorbed the dim light from the single naked bulb overhead. Someone had wiped it down. Someone had placed it here recently. I reached in. The metal was shockingly cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the humid air. I pulled it out, the weight of it settling heavily in my lap. It felt dense, solid. It was locked, of course. I stared at the silver mechanism. On a whim, a terrible, intuitive whim, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I was carrying David's spare key ring. He had left it on the credenza that morning, and I had meant to put it in his valet tray. There was a small, nondescript silver key on the ring. For 20 years, whenever I asked, he told me it was for the filing cabinet in his downtown office. I never had a reason to check. My hand trembled as I isolated the key. The rain hammered louder, a crescendo of warning. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't catch. It didn't struggle. It glided in with a sickeningly smooth precision, as if it were coming home. Click. The sound was deafening in the quiet of the attic. It was the sound of a barrier falling. The lid sprang up an inch. I took a breath that tasted of stale air and fear, and I lifted the lid. I expected stacks of cash, perhaps illicit bonds, maybe even letters from a mistress long gone. Inside, there was no money. There were photographs, dozens of them, stacked with care. My hand moved of its own accord, acting as a separate entity from my paralyzed brain. I picked up the first photo. It was a 4x6 glossy print, high quality. The world stopped. The rain faded into white noise. The photo showed a beach, white sand, tall dunes, and there, in the center of the frame, was David. He was wearing his blue flannel shirt. I stared at the fabric in the photo, my mind racing, trying to process the impossibility of it. It was the cerulean blue plaid shirt with the pearl snaps. He told me he lost that shirt at the dry cleaners 3 years ago. I had fought with the cleaner. I had threatened to sue. I had mourned that shirt because it made his eyes look like the ocean. He was wearing it, and he was smiling. Not the polite, tight-lipped smile he offered at charity galas. Not the weary half-smile he gave me across the breakfast table. This was a smile of unadulterated, radiant joy. His head was thrown back, laughing at something just out of frame, and his hand, his large, manicured hand, was holding on to another hand. A tiny hand. I dropped the photo. It fluttered to the dust, revealing the one beneath it. David, again, sitting on the tailgate of a truck I didn't recognize. He was holding a child, a girl, perhaps 3 years old, with riotous curls of blonde hair and his eyes. He was kissing the top of her head. I dug deeper, my movements becoming frantic, animalistic. I shoveled through the glossy evidence of a parallel life. A birth certificate, Sophie Ann Miller, father, David Miller, date of birth, 4 years ago, a lease agreement for a cottage in Pastoral, Connecticut, signed and dated, a drawing done in thick, waxy crayon on construction paper, a stick figure of a man and a little girl holding hands under a yellow sun. In crude, block letters, it read, "To Daddy, love, Sophie." Nausea rolled over me, a physical wave that started in my gut and burned its way up my throat. The heat of the attic suddenly felt like a kill. The walls were closing in. The smell of the cedar wasn't nostalgic anymore. It was the scent of a coffin. Every business trip, every late night at the firm, every weekend conference, they were all here, documented in high-definition color. He hadn't just cheated. He hadn't just had a fling. He had built an entire world without me. He had a child. He had a home. He had a favorite shirt. I sat there, paralyzed. The glossy reflection of his happiness mocking me from the dusty floorboards. I was holding the evidence of my own erasure then. The sound cut through the roar of the blood in my ears, the heavy thud of the front door opening downstairs, the jingle of keys being tossed into the ceramic bowl in the foyer, the silence that followed, heavy and expectant. Then, his voice, booming up the stairs, cheerful and warm, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. "Honey, I'm home. Where are you hiding?" He was 3 flights down, but as I stared at the photo of him holding another woman's child, his voice didn't sound like a greeting. It sounded like he knew. I didn't take everything. Taking everything would be an admission that this was real, that the box wasn't just a hallucination born of attic heat and old insulation. Instead, I performed a surgical extraction. I slid 3 specific photographs and the lease agreement into the deep pocket of my cashmere robe. They sat there against my hip, stiff and foreign, burning through the fabric like a brand. I replaced the lid. I pushed the box back into its nest of pink fiberglass. I lowered the floorboard. I smoothed the dust over the seam with my sleeve, erasing my presence. Though I knew I could never erase what I had seen, descending the stairs felt like sinking underwater. The air grew cooler, cleaner, more civilized, but the pressure in my head was building to a scream. By the time I reached the hallway, I was composing my face. I am a master of the neutral expression. I have hosted dinner parties while my mother was dying in the guest room, and no one knew until the brandy was served. This was just another performance. Dinner was ready. David was already seated at the head of the mahogany table, the chandelier casting a warm, golden glow over the roast chicken I had prepared earlier. It was a domestic tableau, the kind you see in magazines, the kind I had spent 40 years polishing. "There you are," he said, shaking out his napkin. "I was about to send a search party. Did you find the quilt?" "No," I said. My voice sounded thin, tinny, as if it were coming from a radio in the next room. "It must be in the cedar closet in the basement." I said. I watched him carve the chicken. The knife sliced through the skin with a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach lurch. He served me a thigh. He served himself the breast. He poured the wine, a Cabernet we had been saving. "Good day at the firm?" I asked. The question was a reflex. "Exhausting," he sighed, cutting a piece of meat. "The merger is a nightmare. I might have to go into the office on Saturday." I watched him put the fork in his mouth. I watched his jaw work. The muscles in his temple bunched and relaxed. It was a mechanical, rhythmic motion. Chew-chew, swallow. It was the most mundane action in the world. Yet suddenly, it looked grotesque. I saw the animal underneath the suit. I saw the mouth that had kissed another woman, the teeth that had smiled at a secret child. I watched him wipe a smudge of grease from his lip with the linen napkin, a gesture of fastidious cleanliness from a man living a filthy lie. My hand drifted to my pocket. I fingered the edge of the stolen photographs, the sharp corner of one dug into my thumb. David, I said, keeping my eyes on my unmoving fork. Do you remember the conference in Chicago? The one in the fall of 2018? He paused, his wineglass halfway to his mouth. Chicago? Vaguely. Why? I was just thinking about it. You were so sick before you left. I remembered it with crystalline clarity. October 2018. He had complained of a stomach bug for days. I had packed his suitcase with Pepto-Bismol and bland crackers. I had ironed his shirts with extra starch because he said he wanted to look professional despite feeling ill. I had worried the entire weekend, waiting by the phone, terrified he would collapse in a hotel room alone. Pulled the memory forward and overlaid it with the photograph burning in my pocket. The timestamp on the back of the photo in my pocket read, October 14th, 2018. The image on the front wasn't Chicago. It was Orlando. It was the Magic Kingdom. David wasn't pale and sick in a hotel room. He was wearing mouse ears. He was tanned. He was holding a massive turkey leg in one hand and that little girl in the other. The sky behind him was a piercing, impossible blue. While I was pacing the floor in this house, praying for his recovery, he was riding teacups. Yeah, he said, taking a sip of wine. That was a rough trip. Barely made it out of the hotel room. The presentations were brutal. The lie didn't even waver. It was smooth, practiced, polished by years of repetition. Excuse me, I said, standing up abruptly. The chair scraped harsh against the floor. I don't feel well. I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the dining room, past the foyer, and into the downstairs powder room. I locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the latch. I fell to my knees in front of the toilet and retched. Nothing came up but bile and the sour taste of betrayal. I stayed there for a moment, forehead resting against the cold porcelain, breathing in the scent of lemon cleanser and ruin. Then, I stood up. I washed my face with freezing water. I looked at the woman in the mirror. Her skin was gray. Her eyes were wide and terrified. She looked like a victim. I hated her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lease agreement. I unfolded it on the marble vanity. My hand smoothed the paper. 0.14 to Willow Creek Lane, Oakhaven. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I opened Google Maps. I typed in the address. The satellite view zoomed out, flying over state lines, over highways, dropping a red pin on a town 2 hours north. I switched to Street View. The image resolved. It was a charming house, a craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and hydrangea bushes exploding in blue and purple. It was smaller than our house, warmer, less imposing. It looked lived in, and there, in the driveway, was the detail that shattered me completely. A tricycle that was red, bright fire engine red with streamers on the handlebars. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred. It was a radio flyer, the exact same make and model we had bought for our nephew's 3rd birthday. I remembered David assembling it in our garage, cursing at the instructions, laughing when he finally got the wheels on. He had bought one for his secret daughter, too. The betrayal wasn't just sexual, it was financial, it was emotional, it was comprehensive. I thought about the last 5 years, the lean years at the firm, the cancelled vacation to Italy because money was tight, the way he had asked me to cut back on the gardening service, the way he had fretted over the electric bill. He hadn't been saving money, he had been diverting it. He was funding a second life. He was paying a mortgage on a bungalow in Oakhaven. He was buying groceries and clothes and red tricycles. Every dollar he saved here was a dollar spent there. I wasn't just his wife, I was his financier. I had been subsidizing his infidelity. A sharp knock on the bathroom door made me jump. I nearly dropped the phone into the sink. Martha. David's voice was muffled by the wood, but close, too close. Are you all right? You've been in there a while. I shoved the papers and the phone back into my pocket. I gripped the edge of the vanity, my knuckles turning white. I stared at the door. He was just on the other side. The man who liked roast chicken. The man who wore mouse ears. The stranger, Martha. The knob jiggled. I took a deep breath, forcing the tremor out of my voice. I'm fine, David, I called out. Just a migraine. The sudden weather change. Do you need anything? No, I said. Just a minute. I looked back at the mirror. The victim was gone. In her place was something colder, something harder. I knew the address, I knew the face, I knew the lie, but knowing wasn't enough. Pictures can be staged, documents can be forged. I needed to smell the air in Oakhaven. I needed to see the red tricycle with my own eyes. I needed to stand on the lawn of one Willow Creek Lane and watch the walls of his perfect secret come crumbling down. I unlocked the door. How far is a 2-hour drive when you've already traveled 20 years into a lie? The morning sun was a liar. It painted the world in cheerful, optimistic golds that had no business existing on the day my life finally ended. I called the office at 8 a.m. sharp, feigning a migraine with a voice that was raspy from a sleepless night of staring at the ceiling. I listened to David's morning routine from beneath the duvet, shower running, the hum of his electric razor, the heavy tread of his feet on the hardwood. He kissed my forehead before he left, a dry, perfunctory peck that felt like a seal of betrayal. "Feel better, darling," he whispered. "I'll try to be home early." The moment the garage door rumbled shut, I was moving. I dressed in dark clothes, efficient and nondescript, shedding the silks and cashmere for something that felt like armor. The drive to Oakhaven was a 2-hour fugue state. The highway unspooled before me, a gray ribbon of concrete that I consumed with a terrifying mechanical focus. I don't remember the towns I passed. I don't remember the music on the radio. I only remember the vibration of the steering wheel under my hands. I was gripping the leather so tightly that my knuckles turned the color of old bone. The circulation cut off, my hands numb blocks of ice. I was fueled by a cold, calculating fury that sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I arrived in Oakhaven just before noon. The GPS led me away from the highway, down tree-lined streets that screamed of Americana and apple pie. And then, I saw it. 142 Willow Creek Lane. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a grand estate like the mausoleum David and I inhabited. It was a cottage. Pale yellow siding, white shutters, a wraparound porch with a swing that drifted lazily in the breeze. It was the house I had begged David to buy 30 years ago. The house he had sneered at, calling it quaint and beneath us. He told me we couldn't afford a second property, that we needed to invest in his image. And here it was, paid for with my sacrifices. I parked 3 houses down, killing the engine. I watched. The front door opened. A woman stepped out. She was younger than me, perhaps in her late 30s, but she didn't look like the femme fatale I had conjured in my nightmares. She wore yoga pants and a stained t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired. She looked worn down, etched with the same exhaustion that I felt in my marrow. She was sweeping the porch, a mundane, domestic task that felt like a slap in the face. Then, a car turned onto the street. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape. It was David's sedan, the silver Mercedes I had watched pull out of our driveway 3 hours ago. He hadn't gone to the firm. He hadn't gone to a client meeting. He had come here. I watched my husband step out of the car. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. He had loosened his tie. He looked relaxed, lighter. The woman looked up and smiled a genuine, relieved smile. She dropped the broom and walked down the steps. He met her halfway. He kissed her. It wasn't a passionate, movie star kiss. It was the comfortable, familiar kiss of a husband greeting his wife. Then, the front door burst open again. A blur of pink and blonde rushed out. "Daddy." David knelt on the pavement, ignoring the dirt on his dress trousers. The trousers I took to the dry cleaners and scooped the child up. He spun her around. The sound of her laughter drifted down the street, piercing the glass of my windshield, sharp as a needle. I couldn't breathe. The physical reality of it hit me like a punch to the gut, doubling me over in the driver's seat. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It wasn't a piece of paper. It was flesh and blood. It was a yellow house and a red tricycle and a life that was stolen from me. Dollar by dollar, hour by hour. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream. I didn't ram my car into his. That would be too easy. That would be messy. I started the car and drove home. The fury that had been cold was now molten. By 6 p.m., the stage was set. I had prepared the dining room with the same meticulous care I gave to our anniversary dinners. The crystal was polished. The candles were in the silver holders, though unlit, but there was no food. The kitchen was cold and dark. At David's place setting, directly on the placemat where his charger plate usually sat, I laid them out. The 3 photos, the lease agreement, the birth certificate. I sat at the other end of the long, empty table. I didn't turn on the chandelier. I sat in the shadows, a statue of judgment, waiting for the accused. 6:15 p.m., the garage door opened. 6:17 p.m., the heavy thud of the door connecting the garage to the kitchen. 6:18 p.m., footsteps. Cheerful, heavy footsteps. "Martha," he called out, "it smells clean in here." Did you order in? He walked into the dining room. He reached for the dimmer switch on the wall. Click. The light flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving. David stopped. He was holding his briefcase in one hand and a bouquet of grocery store tulips in the other, guilt offering. He looked at me, sitting rigid at the head of the table. Then, he looked down at his seat. He froze. The color drained from his face so fast it was like watching a blinds being drawn. He dropped the tulips. They hit the floor with a soft, pathetic, wet thud. He stared at the photo of himself in the Mickey ears. He stared at the lease. "Martha," he croaked. His voice was unrecognizable. "Martha, I can explain." I didn't blink. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, deadly. It didn't sound like my own. It sounded like the voice of the attic, dry and ancient. "Explain the blue shirt, David." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the paperwork again, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "Explain," I continued, rising slowly from my chair, "why our savings account is empty. Explain why I have been clipping coupons and firing gardeners while that house, that yellow cottage, has a brand new roof." He took a step back, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "It's complicated, Martha. You don't understand. I didn't want to hurt you. It just happened. I was going to tell you when," I snapped, the volume rising. "When were you going to tell me? When Sophie graduated high school, when I was dead. I was trying to protect you," he shouted, the gaslighting kicking in, a desperate defense mechanism. "I was trying to do the right thing. I support them, yes, but I stayed with you. I never left you. You didn't stay because you loved me." I screamed, the explosion finally tearing through my composure. I grabbed the heavy metal lockbox from the floor beside me and hurled it down the length of the table. It skidded across the mahogany, gouging the wood, and crashed into the centerpiece, shattering the vase. "You stayed because you needed me." I walked toward him, stepping over the broken glass. "You needed my inheritance. You needed my social standing. You needed my stability to fund your little fantasy life in Oakhaven." I stopped inches from his face. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of the other woman's perfume on his shirt. "You wanted to be the hero," I hissed, spitting the words into his face. "You wanted to be the savior to her and the provider to me. But look at you, David. You aren't a hero." I looked down at the pathetic bouquet of tulips on the floor. "You're just the villain in two different stories." He slumped into the chair, putting his head in his hands, defeated. The silence that returned to the room was heavy, suffocating, and final. But as I looked at the back of his neck, defenseless and exposed, I realized the shouting was over. The anger was evaporating, replaced by something much colder, something permanent. I picked up the heavy brass candlestick from the table. "I'm done listening, David," I whispered. "Now, it's time for you to see what I've really been doing in the library all these years." The silence that fills the house now is different. Before, the quiet was a heavy, expectant thing, a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the sound of David's car in the driveway, or the heavy tread of his footsteps on the stairs, or the drone of the television news he insisted on watching at volume 30. It was a silence that demanded I make myself smaller, quieter, so as not to disturb the equilibrium of his double life. But now the silence is expansive. It breathes. It stretches into the corners of the high ceilings and settles like a fine, cool mist over the furniture. It is not the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of liberation. David is gone. I didn't just kick him out. I excised him. He is currently staying at the Motel 6, off the interstate, a poetic justice I savor, considering his refined tastes. Or perhaps he has fled to the yellow cottage in Oakhaven, to ruin that fantasy with the harsh reality of his failure. I don't care. The moment he walked out the door with his suitcase hastily packed, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him, the spell broke. The next morning, I didn't weep. I didn't collapse into a heap of despair on the foyer floor. I woke up, stretched my limbs in the center of the king-sized bed that was finally all mine, and I started the work of reclamation. It began with the recliner, that hideous, overstuffed brown leather monstrosity he had insisted on keeping in the living room for 20 years. I dragged it across the hardwood floor myself, the metal base screeching a protest that sounded like music to my ears. I shoved it out the front door and down the porch steps. It landed on the lawn with a dull, defeated thud. I left it there for the garbage men, a bloated carcass of a marriage that had died long ago. Then, I went to the hardware store. I bought 5 gallons of paint. The color was called Aegean Deep, a rich, vibrant, unapologetic teal, For decades, David had insisted on neutral tones. He liked safe sand and off-white colors that wouldn't offend, colors that hid dirt, colors that said nothing. I spent 3 days painting the living room. My shoulders ached, and my hair was speckled with blue, but with every stroke of the roller, I was erasing him. I covered the beige, I covered the safety, I covered the bland backdrop of his lies. The smell of fresh paint, sharp, clean, and chemical filled the house, masking the lingering scent of his cigars and the stale, dusty smell of the past. When I was finished, the room looked like the bottom of the ocean, deep, mysterious, and beautiful. While the paint dried, I handled the business of severance. I didn't use the family solicitor. I hired a man named Mr. Sterling, a divorce attorney with a reputation for being a shark in a three-piece suit. I sat in his glass-walled office, placed the lockbox on his desk, and laid out the photos, the lease, and the bank statements I had unearthed. "I don't want an apology," I told him, my voice steady. "I want the house. I want the portfolio. I want the pension. He can have the cottage and the debt." Mr. Sterling had looked at the evidence, then at me, and smiled a smile that was all teeth. "Consider it done." But the true resolution wasn't in the legal paperwork or the redecorated living room. It came tonight. I am sitting on the back stone patio. The air is crisp, biting with the promise of coming winter. I have a glass of vintage Pinot Noir in my hand, the bottle David was saving for his retirement. I opened it an hour ago. It tastes excellent. I have a fire going in the stone pit. The flames are hungry, licking at the dry oak logs. I have the photos in my lap, the glossy prints that shattered my world. I pick up the one of David in the blue flannel shirt, the shirt he lost, the smile I didn't recognize. We all think we know the people we sleep next to. We memorize the rhythm of their breathing. We know how they take their coffee. We think their silence is peace, a comfortable companionability born of years together. But sometimes, silence is just a container. It is a vault where they store the things they cannot say. We mistake proximity for intimacy. I realize now that finding the box wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was the 10 years I spent blind, walking through this house, sleeping in that bed, believing in a reality that was nothing more than a stage set. I was an actor in a play where everyone else had the script but me. Finding the box wasn't the end of my life. It was the cure. It was the scalpel that cut out the rot. I tossed the photo into the fire. It doesn't burn like paper. Because of the glossy coating, it bubbles first. The image of David's face blisters and warps, melting into a grotesque mask before the edges catch. Then, it curls inward, blackening, consumed by the orange heat. I throw in the lease agreement. It flares up instantly, turning to gray ash that floats up into the night sky like dirty snowflakes. I throw in the drawing, "To Daddy, love Sophie." That one hurts a little. A momentary pang for an innocent child caught in the crossfire of a narcissist's ego. But it goes in, to Dot. I watch them burn, until there is nothing left but ash and memory. The smoke drifting up from the pit is black and oily. It smells of melting plastic and chemicals. It stings my eyes, but as I inhale the cool night breeze that rushes in to replace it, I realize something. The air has never smelled so clean. I am 62 years old. I am alone in a teal room. And for the first time in decades, the roof over my head is solid. There are no more leaks. There are no more loose floorboards. I take a sip of the wine, watching the embers die down to a dull, pulsing glow. The attic is empty now. The secrets are out, and I am, finally, truly, home. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library. Waiting for you.